Hello, I'm Barry Daniel, and this is the podcast of the Middle Way Society. Our aim is to encourage a universal approach to living a more integrated, ethical life, avoiding dogma or any appeal to authority. My guest today is Alva Noë. Alva is Professor of Philosophy at the University of California, Berkeley. His work has focused mainly on the theory of perception and consciousness, which straddles the fields of cognitive science and the philosophy of mind. He's also interested in phenomenology, the philosophy of John Dewey, for example, and the theory of art. His books include Action in Perception, Out of Our Heads, Varieties of Presence, as well as his latest book, Strange Tools, Art and Human Nature, which will be the topic of our discussion today. Hello, Alva. Welcome to the Middle Way Society podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, well, could you begin, Alva, by telling us maybe a bit about your background and what prompted you to write this particular book?
Well, I've been a student of perception and consciousness for a long time now. I finished my PhD in 1995, and my PhD was on the theory of perception and philosophy, and then I sort of dived into cognitive science. And in a way, the whole problem of art as a domain in which we reflect on objects of perceptual contemplation is a sort of a natural next step for somebody with my interests. But in fact, my route to this project is a little bit more complicated than that. My first book, which you just mentioned, Action in Perception, developed a very specific idea that there is a surprisingly intimate relationship between perception on the one hand and the moving body and action on the other. Uh-huh. The familiar way to think about the relationship between perception and action is that we perceive and then we can make plans and then we can act, so that perception is sort of input from the world to the mind and action is output from the mind to the world. But I argued, and I didn't do this on my own, I did it in collaboration with a number of other philosophers and scientists. I became interested in the way in which that actually our capacities to perceive and our capacities to act are really two sides of the same coin. Mm-hmm. And in Action and Perception, I argued that we should really think of perception as an activity of exploring the environment, and in particular, an activity that draws on a particular kind of knowledge, a practical bodily knowledge about, as I put it in that book, the ways in which our own movements produce sensory events. So every time I blink or turn my head or move forward or backwards, I create sensory events. Yeah. And I argued in that book, and there I was really drawing on my very close collaboration with the psychologist J. Kevin O'Regan. But we argued that this knowledge of what happens when you move your body is really crucial for understanding what experience is. Mm-hmm. It's sort of paradoxical because you might think experience is inside the head and action is something you do outside in the world with your body. But what I wanted to argue is that no, actually, experience, consciousness is actually something itself that we do, something that we make. You mentioned John Dewey in your introduction, and that's a very John Deweyan idea. Yeah. Dewey had this conception of experience as a process of doing and undergoing and doing and undergoing and doing and undergoing the effects of what you have done. So I'm giving you a very long answer, but the reason I'm mentioning this in response to your background question is that really, to my great delight and surprise, I found that people in the community of dance artists, took a great interest in what I was writing. They recognized in it some information that they already had about the importance of movement for human experience. And moreover, they saw the possibility for an interesting dialogue between the kind of work I was doing and the sort of work that they as artists were doing in the studio. So I got invited sort of as an outsider to be present in a very intimate way inside a dance making creation process. And then that got me thinking, okay, so what is the relationship between what dancers are doing and what a philosopher is doing, or what a cognitive science is doing, or what does the work of a dancer tell us about consciousness or perception. So that was one of the very important roots that led me to go deeper into this project.
Okay, and that makes me think of something that was in the book, that you also gained a really important insight through a conversation with an artist when you were at graduate school. Could you tell us about that and how that relates to the progression of your work culminating in this book?
Yeah, thank you very much for that. That's kind of a nice question for me, because it's both substantive and also personal. You know, one of the things about me, and it's both one of my strengths and my limitations, is that I've always enjoyed doing philosophy as it arises in conversation with people outside of philosophy, whether it's neuroscientists or artists. And when I was in graduate school, my focus was really on trying to learn about cognitive science and what the empirical science of the human mind had to teach us. And in particular, I was studying something called vision science. And one day I was in conversation with an artist, an older guy, and he said, well, what is this thing you're studying, vision science? And I said, well, in vision science, we're interested in the fact that we experience the surrounding world of meaningful objects in three-dimensional space, and yet we're given two tiny, distorted, upside-down, vibrating images in the eyes, in retinal images. How do we see so much on the basis of so little? And this artist looked at me like I was really bonkers, and he hissed through his teeth, and he was clearly irritated with me. And he finally said, look, that's nonsense. The interesting question is, or at least ought to be, not how do we see so much on the basis of so little, but why do we see so little when in fact there's so much around us to see? Mm-hmm. And my first reaction when he said that to me was to think, oh, okay, he doesn't get it. He doesn't understand the logic of the scientific problem. But it was really only years later that I began to think maybe he'd been onto something, actually, in a more profound way. And I've already told you about my approach to perception, the so-called inactive approach to perception and consciousness. And the central idea there is that we think of perception as something that we achieve or make, rather than as something that is triggered inside of us by an action on our nervous system. And that in a weird way, it suddenly dawned on me at one point that what that artist had been getting at was, in a way, what I'd been trying to establish in my subsequent work. So it was almost as if he planted an idea in my mind, and I went with it. And it wasn't just the idea that, at least as I think, and not everybody agrees with me, of course, but it's not just that I thought that the artist was right. It's that I realized that there was something remarkable about the fact that the artist was right. Yeah. That is, it was in some way the source of his insight, which I came to believe was a really significant insight that mattered for science. But the source of his insight was his practice as an artist. Mm. And that led me to think, that was not the only thing that had led me to think this, but it, in a very strong way, suggested to me, maybe, when scientists look at art and think it's a phenomenon that they're going to explain, maybe they're approaching things the wrong way. Maybe we should instead think of art as itself a field of research, a field in which special kinds of knowledge and explanations are sought after. And maybe what we really, maybe really need to reorient the project and think, how can I work with artists to learn about what interests us both, namely the nature of human being? And so that was a very significant thing. I should say that the artist in question actually was my father, and so it was very rewarding for me. First of all, it was very easy for me to think he was an idiot when he first responded to me, but it was also very gratifying to think that I was, in some sense, profiting from my exchange with him.
What a lovely story! It actually reminds me of something Someone told me recently, you might have heard her, she's a social psychologist, Ellen and Langer, and also interestingly an artist. And she said something like, mindfulness is something, the thing that she studies is the art of noticing new things, and I sort of see a bit of a connection there.
That's very interesting.
Anyway, let's maybe move on to some of the themes that that you explored in the book. You suggest boredom may give us a clue to what art is and why it matters to us. Could you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, gladly. That's a potentially, I mean, that's an odd thing to say. I mean, one of the things. So I'm trying to be a little bit provocative when I make that statement.
Yeah.
But it was also a little bit of a personal discovery that I made. It's actually kind of one of the sort of, I think, genuinely original moments in the book, because I was trying to get at the way in which this. First of all, I'm using boredom in a special way. I mean, boredom can mean different things in ordinary language, and we can talk about being bored in different ways. But I definitely noticed when I was a child that there was a certain kind of boredom that very rarely, but once in a while, I experienced, and it had to do with being in the summertime or maybe on a Sunday when there were no events planned, there was nothing to do, and I found myself with a very distinct sense of time as having been slowed down to a metronome of sort of second after second after second, and moreover, a feeling of being trapped inside of that all you could do was endure the passage of time. So it's almost like being trapped. It's like almost claustrophobic and irritated. It's a negative emotional state. And then I realized that we rarely experience that as grown-ups. And I think the basic explanation of why we don't experience it as grown-ups is that the whole process of growing up is a process of organizing our lives in terms of meaningful projects. Mm-hmm. So there's like, our conversation together this morning, or my time as a professor at the University of California, or the civil war in Syria, or childhood. Or we can talk about, we organize our lives in these arcs of projects and activities which have beginnings and middles and ends. And one of the consequences of thinking about life that way is there's a sense in which you always kind of know what the end is at the beginning. Just like when you throw a ball up in the air, you know where it's going to come down roughly, because of the ballistics. Life is a bit ballistic in that way. At least that's the way we live it. We live inside these projects. I think that's one of the reasons also, this is a little side point, one of the reasons why time seems to speed up for grown-ups, because they're not living in the metronome, they're living in this other narrative structure on top of it. Anyway, so I had this realization, this is the point I meant was kind of original. I had this realization that just about the only time I've ever experienced anything like that boredom of childhood, but as an adult, was when looking at art. And I say that as somebody who likes art. I don't say that as somebody who thinks, art is boring. I suddenly realized a lot of times art is boring. And it doesn't even need to be bad art to be boring. Yeah. Sometimes if you're in a museum, you can just have this feeling of all these things to look at and where do I begin? And it's as if time grinds to a halt and you just can't wait to leave, or you're stuck in the theater. And so I started to think, I mean, one possibility is sometimes art is boring because sometimes it's not good. But is it possible that actually boredom is a gift that art gives us? That art lets us be bored when everything else makes boredom impossible. Everything else militates against it because we're caught up in the sweep of our busy, organized lives. Could it be that art, precisely because it interrupts those busy engagements, precisely because it makes us turn off our cell phones, is it possible that art puts us in a situation where we're vulnerable to boredom, but we're also vulnerable to something very, very positive, namely, actually to use a word that you used before, but that I don't actually use in this connection in the book, but that I might have used, mindfulness. Yeah. I mean, there's a sense in which when we're dealing with art, we really need to pay attention and look and find meaning or make meaning. We can't take meaning for granted. To take meaning for granted is to be in the project zone.
Yeah.
But when you're with art, you just can't, well, it's a picture, but everything is there's nothing is certain. What it's supposed to be showing, what it's supposed to mean, why it's supposed to be good, if it's any good, all of these questions that you have, you're really thrown back on yourself. And I think one form that takes is this feeling of, oh my God, I'm stuck. I have nothing to do to get through this. But I don't mean that all art is boring or that all art is always boring, or that even that some art is always boring. But it does seem to me that the connection between art and boredom is an interesting one. And in fact, it's a special case of a more general phenomenon, which is art isn't just about good feeling or pleasure. A lot of time art is baffling, confusing, disorienting, not always, but even, and I don't just mean modern art. I don't just mean, art after Duchamp. Sometimes, even if, you're looking at some sort of great master, well, it's just a picture of a guy. What are you supposed to think about it? What are you supposed to do with it? And I think art in a way always gives you this question of trying to find within yourself or within the work the resources to make something out of it. And I think little kids understand that because they're comfortable saying, "Oh no, I don't want to go to the museum." and then a lot of times parents will say, "No, it's good. This is art. This is good. This is good for you. You should see this." But in a way, that's kind of faking it because it's not easy to really show why it's valuable or good to look at art. And I think art should have to prove itself and does have to prove itself. And that was another one of Dewey's great ideas. He said, just because it's hanging on the wall of a museum doesn't mean it's going to give you anything. You don't have an art experience just by paying the price of admission into the gallery. You have to do something.
Sure, yeah. So would you say puzzlement should be the real recognition tool for art?
Yeah, I think in a very general sense, puzzlement, curiosity. I'm not at all an expert on Buddhism, but I've heard Buddhists talk about the don't know mind. Yeah. You accept not knowing.
Yeah.
You accept that there isn't a right answer.
Yeah.
There isn't one reading of the painting, just as there isn't one answer to a philosophical problem. That doesn't make philosophical problems bogus problems. It just means that they occupy a different space. And I think similarly with art. So, and the one kind of correction I want to make, not to you, but to the word puzzle, is I like the idea that the word puzzle or curiosity, that those are cognitive words. I like the fact that art presents cognitive challenges, and I think it does. But I think it's also important to realize that doesn't mean it's not also presenting emotional challenges or challenges that have to do with response, because to me that's a very false dichotomy, the idea that intellect is on one side and feeling on the other.
Exactly. Yeah.
As the choreographer William Forsythe once said to me, for me, ideas are emotional. Yeah. And I think that's true.
Yeah. And I suppose from our perspective in the in the middle way society, the arts are really meaningful to embodied experience. I mean, look, you were talking earlier about dance, but like music is also a good example of this. The rhythms of music are meaningful to us because of their relationship to our heartbeat and pulse, and melody relates to our physical experience of vocalization. Now, you talk in the book about this. You talk a lot about organization. Do you mean organized in an embodied sense? After all, we are organisms.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's exactly what I mean. So a good friend of mine read the book when it was in draft form, and he said, "Why are you talking about organization all the time? Is this a book for business students or something? Is this about business school organization seminars?" And no, for me, the primary root of organization is in this notion that we're organisms. And it was Immanuel Kant who first really understood that what distinguishes the living from the rest of the physical world is the distinct manner of its organization. Indeed, what Kant was the first person, I believe, to use the term self-organizing to describe the biological.
Okay.
He really recognized that there was something different about the way matter gets organized in the vicinity of the living than in the vicinity of the non-living. So I'm definitely interested in the notion of organism of organization as connected to our biology. But you use the word embodiment, and embodiment is ambiguous because, we're embodied at the cellular level.
Yeah.
But we're also bodied at the whole organism level. As human beings, we have habits and things that we do with our whole bodies. And one of the things that I'm committed to, and I think this is an idea that will be congenial to you, is that certain phenomena need to be looked at the whole organism level. You can't reduce them to something going on inside the organism, or they depend on what's going on inside the organism, but they don't reduce. And so, like, I'm interested in the way in which we're caught up in interactions with each other and our environment, and that these are habitual. They're not controlled by conscious deliberation, but nor are they just stuff happening in our cells either. They are things we're doing. So one of my favorite examples is the case of breastfeeding, where the mother and the infant get caught up in this really exquisite dynamic of responding to each other and negotiating the act of breastfeeding, which it turns out for human beings among all the mammals is quite difficult. We're not very good breastfeeders. And so, we're so bad at it that it's been speculated that maybe we don't breastfeed in order to feed, but we feed that way in order to afford the possibility for this dance. Yeah. And so it's, for me, breastfeeding it exhibits certain properties of organization, which you see, I think, in dance or in conversation or in driving or in walking or in tool use or in a whole range of activities. So in the book, I introduce a kind of a notion of organized activity that's meant to be an ordinary term, which I give a sort of precise meaning. I don't know if you want me to go into those details here, but I give a kind of a set of criteria for what it is to be an organized activity. And then I point out that our lives, in a way, can be thought of as complex structures of organized activity, and that there are two interesting features of that fact. One is that, actually three interesting features, one of which I just said, namely that you need to think of it at the embodiment level, not at the subpersonal cellular level, to understand these patterns of organization. Another way to put that is that the question of agency is complex when you're thinking about these. It's not as though the baby is the agent of breastfeeding, but nor is the mother the agent of breastfeeding. They're both kind of doing it together. It just happens. Yeah. And it happens to them. It happens to them.
It evolves.
So it emerges even, you'd say. So one feature is that the question of the level at which to analyze the phenomenon is quite interesting and subtle when thinking about what I call organized activity. Another is that, as I also already said, organized activity is really deserves to be thought of as biological in a rich sense of biology. So that means you need a conception of biology and of biological human nature that embraces human sociality and culturalness. Culture is not, again, just as feeling is not opposed to thought, I don't think culture is opposed to nature. We are naturally cultural, and a lot of our modes of existence are cultural, but are natural for all that, I would say. And then the third point about organized activity, which is important to me for the book, is that I think from a sort of existential point of view, we're lost in our organizations. We don't have a kind of a map or a guide that reveals our organizations to ourselves. It can be very surprising the ways we find ourselves organized. And one of the guiding arguments of the book is that art and philosophy are ways of revealing our own patterns of organization to us, so that they're unveiling ourselves to ourselves, and that they do that in ways that end up willy-nilly reorganizing us and changing us. It's not necessarily progress towards a perfect end point.
No.
But every time I mean, a really nice example of this is we have all these bodily habits, but if you start dancing, I don't mean dancing in the club with your girlfriend. I mean dancing with an artist. He'll start making you do movements that are not spontaneous to you. They're not natural to you.
Yeah.
He'll make you start investigating your bodily habits. And in investigating your bodily habits, you learn something about yourself.
Yeah, yeah.
And you also gain new habits,
Yeah.
and can do new things.
So you're touching on there, arguably the difference between dancing and choreography. Could you just expand on that a little bit?
Well, in a way, you're right. I was touching on it. In a way, I have the idea that choreography isn't just more dancing, that choreographers are people who are making, I mean, this is an obvious point in a way. Choreographers are people making art out of the raw materials of dancing. But what are those raw materials? Well, it's the fact that human beings dance, that you and I dance. We are dancers by culture, but by nature. So when choreographers put dance on display, they're really putting us on display and putting something about us on display. And if I'm right in what I said earlier, they're also putting it on display in a way that inevitably changes it for us and changes dancing for us, so that it becomes, as I put it, a reorganizational practice. So I think of choreography as really, as choreography works with the raw materials of dancing, just as I believe painting as an art works with the raw materials of picture making. And you made a very interesting observation before, which I think is only partial, but is very important, namely that music works with other aspects of human embodiment and rhythm and heartbeat and all of that. I think that's exactly right. So that music brings that out and shows us that about ourselves, just as dance does in a slightly different domain. So I have this picture of, if you think of these organized activities, think of them as sort of neighborhoods. And then I think of art and philosophy as kind of, this is an analogy. Actually, I don't quite put it this way in the book, but you can almost think of art and philosophy as kind of like cartography of those neighborhoods. Like they're making maps that we can use. Why? Because we're lost. We need maps. We need orientation. But the maps, once you have the maps, now the analogy maybe doesn't work anymore. But then I want to say that once you have the maps, it changes the neighborhood. It changes the way you live in the neighborhood. And so that you get this very productive looping back down. Art loops back down into life and gets entangled with it.
Okay, well, this has made me think of a wonderful story on the radio in the UK a few years ago. It was entitled "The History of the World in 100 Objects," and the narrator, this guy called Neil McGregor, chose as one of the early examples a hand axe from about 1.2 million years ago. And what he said that for me that was really interesting about these artifacts is that they seem to have been more than simple functional tools. For example, their symmetry in 2 or sometimes 3 planes showed a design more than the utilitarian. Now, and in this one in particular, the one that we were speaking about, it was twice the size of a normal one, giving it arguably no functional use at all. So it hints at this idea that it was symbolic in some sense. Could this be construed as a looping back, even then 1.2 million years ago? Could this be an early piece of art, possibly?
Yeah, that's, when you talk about things that are so old, you can only speculate. But I mean, I'll tell you this: if you go back 30,000 years ago and look at around 30 to 50,000 years ago, there was a huge technological explosion. That's when the cave paintings were made, and that's when there's evidence that's when clothing and sewing got invented and established. And people often use that date, about 30,000 years ago, as the mark of the emergence of the psychologically modern human being. Anatomically modern human beings had been around for longer still, anyway, what's interesting to me is that when you look at the cave paintings, and again, I preface this by saying this is pure speculation.
Yeah, yeah.
There's no way to justify this claim. I don't have the knowledge to justify it. But when I look at those paintings, I think these paintings are coming at the end of a long history. These paintings are sophisticated. These paintings are made by people that knew other paintings and learned from painters and went to schools. Like, these paintings have an art history. So it goes back much earlier. So I can see no reason not to allow that it goes back all the way. I mean, it goes back to the beginning, at least to your acts. But there's and I have to be very careful here because I don't want to paint myself into a corner. But I do think that there is an interesting puzzle about how to think about the evolutionary background of art, given the fact that in a weird way, in a way I tried to explain in the book, art seems to be presupposed by the technologies that art presupposes. In other words, you might think first you have tools and then you have artistic playing around with tools like your acts.
Yeah.
But the first invention of tools was probably a very art-like thing to do. I mean, it was very creative, like the invention of writing. Think of how self-reflective you would have had to be about language to invent writing. So it's almost as if, and then writing influences speech again. So you have speech. Actually, you know what? I'm kind of tying myself in knots here. This is a point I'm really not quite sure I understand adequately. But suffice it to say, I think that we don't yet have any really good, convincing evolutionary biological stories about the origins of art. And I think that could turn out to be an interesting fact.
Sure, yeah. No, it's great to see you thinking on your feet there, Alva.
Yeah. Trying to. Yeah.
Well, just made me think there. So, how does organization differ from technology, or does it differ?
That's a very good question. It's a smart question. In a way, they are coordinate with each other.
Okay.
Fundamentally, it's the same phenomenon. So, what I call an organized activity is I guess maybe the way to put it is that organization is the more general notion. So, what I call an organized activity is a domain which involves skill and knowledge and know-how, practical skill gets put to work in organized activities, whether or not there is an implement or device or tool being used in those organized activities. So I think that when two people talk, they're participating in this highly skilled organized activity, but there isn't an implement that they're using. Now, the invention of implements to do things, tools, and then more broader technologies like language and writing and the internet and air travel and all the whole works of all the different things technology can be. Technologies are effectively principles or means of establishing patterns of organization. So in a way, you could look at the history of technology from the point of view of the artifacts, or you could look at it from the point of view of the actions in which the artifacts are placed. And what I would basically say is that a technology is the history of technology is the history of evolving patterns of organization.
Okay, no, that makes
sense. So they're very, very closely coupled, these two notions.
Sure, yeah. Okay, just moving on to another theme in the book. You suggest that human reactions to art are more like judgements.
That's right. And in a way, when I say that, I'm really making a point that's sort of shorthand for a more complicated idea. I mean, I think of aesthetic experiences as not sort of like light bulbs going off in our minds. I think of them as more like, I compare an aesthetic experience to a dinner. If you and I go to dinner, what shapes the evening will be the food, the setting, the alcohol, the conversation, how we feel about each other, whether we're hungry,
Yeah.
whether we can afford it. I mean, there's so many different factors that will go into determining the quality of the evening. And if I then ask you, was it a good meal? There isn't a simple yes or no. I mean, there may be a simple yes or no, but that yes or no is going to be shorthand for, well, it was so good to see Barry again, but boy, that wine was lousy, or that wine was great, and I got real tipsy, but didn't really enjoy the food. I didn't even pay attention to the food. I was having such a good time, I didn't even worry about it. Wait, the point is that what we call the aesthetic experience is not this simple, sort of one-track kind of thing. It's this very complex thing. And I think when we're reflecting on our aesthetic experiences, we're reflecting on something that's really very complicated, and we're making quite subtle judgments about what happened. And there's a further factor which is important, which is that also how I feel about the meal might depend on how you feel about the meal. I might be influenced by you. And not just in the sense that not in a bad way. You might say, you know what I really loved about that fish? I loved the way it was prepared in this way. And that will let me notice something that I never would have noticed on my own.
So that just makes me think of how one potentially judges objects of art. Now, there is a school of thought that all art is just subjective. But given what you've just said there, could we be objective in our judgments in an incremental sense about, say, measuring the worth of one particular piece of art to another? Can we say that this portrait by Rembrandt is better than this portrait by someone who'd only had 6 months training in portraiture? Can we make judgments like that?
I think we can. And, one of the beautiful things about art is that people disagree.
Yeah.
They disagree even among artists, whether one is better than another, or for an artist, whether not every Rembrandt is as good as any other Rembrandt. And, or sometimes people even disagree about whether art is really so important or so valuable in the first place, in a political culture.
Yeah.
The government officials have to make decisions about whether it's worth funding and to what level it's worth funding. I mean, the question of art's value is something that people argue and debate about. And I think it's not as though it's a free-for-all. It's not as though anything goes. On the other hand, there's no rules for deciding who's right and who's wrong. So it's in that sense, it's like philosophy or like ethics. It's a space in which we think and try to offer reasons for our responses and explanations for our responses, but there's no big stick that we can use to demand of others that they agree with us. Wittgenstein said, in art, the question is not, do you like it, but why do you like it?
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, it's a really nice point, because what it does is it just points out that I like it is just the first move in a conversation. And maybe you'll come to see it the way I do, but maybe not. And maybe that will actually, mark a limit to whether you and I can be part of the same community or whether we can be friends. If we have very, very different reactions, maybe that's kind of going to limit. It's cool. Exactly. The more the merrier. But on the other hand, these disagreements can really matter to people.
Sure, yeah. In our society, in the middle way society, we very much see the arts as an integrative practice, particularly in relation to the integration of meaning. In the arts, for example, can help to cultivate a tolerance of ambiguity. Now, this seems to tie in very much with your idea of instability and just throwing us off edge. And I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. It's actually, I think it's a really important insight that you have, because it's not as though a work of art has attached to it a practical value. This is good, or this is beautiful, or this is educational, or this is this is valuable for this reason. Instead, works of art are really just big question marks. they're, what am I? Says the work of art to the innocent bystander. What could I be?
Yeah.
What value might I have? Maybe I don't have any value. Maybe you're wasting your time looking at me. Maybe you're not. You have to decide that for yourself. So certainly the tolerance of ambiguity is important. And I think the same is true in philosophy. I'm a philosophy teacher, a philosophy professor, and I have found that some students love philosophy and some students hate philosophy. And it's not that the ones who love it are smarter than the ones who don't like it. Some people, I think, find that space of accepting that we don't know how to resolve the puzzle. Some people find that a comfortable place, a fun, exciting place intellectually, and some people find it repellent. They want something they can use. They want a bottom line. They want some knowledge. And I mean, one of the interesting things about philosophy is that the final measure of a philosopher's value is never does everybody else in philosophy agree with him? Because if that were the case, then there would be no good philosophers, because there's no such thing as that kind of agreement. Rather, philosophy I believe, is a field in which ideas are investigated in a way that is constantly enabling philosophers to gain new forms of understanding. But it's not understanding that consists in knowing the truth. It's understanding that consists in understanding the interconnections between problems in different ways. And art is the same way.
Yeah.
So it's certainly, art is the enemy. Art and philosophy are the enemy of dogmatism, for sure.
Oh, well, that brings me into my next question very succinctly. What is your understanding of the middle way, Alva, if any? And how might that relate to what we've been talking about today? I could tell you
Well,
go on. No, go on.
Yeah, no, you tell me. You tell me about it.
Well, I suppose very briefly, the middle way, as we understand it, is that if you avoid fixed judgments or dogma or metaphysical beliefs or cognitive biases, whatever you want to call them, then it puts you in a place where you can make better judgments. And the sort of inside out, the flip side of that is then once you're in that place, then you're in a more integrative state. Maybe you're in this state which you call the reorganized state, where you practice can occur and where you can cultivate potentially. You talked about ambiguity, and just because we can't be certain about things, that doesn't mean that we can't be decisive without having absolute knowledge about things. Anyway, that's roughly the idea. And as I said earlier, that one important aspect of integration is the integration of meaning, and the arts, I think, are very helpful in that regard, because not only does it help you to increase your fund of symbols that make things more meaningful, and then you can clarify those symbols as well through the contextualization of seeing more art or the books you read, etc., or the music that you hear. But again, it's the important thing is this cultivation of the tolerance of ambiguity, so that you get less stuck in sort of cognitive models or in these organized habitual states, and they can sort of knock you out of them and make you blink. And anyway, that's
I'm very sympathetic to everything that you've just said, and I think it probably sums up my general attitude. But one thing I would add, not in disagreement, but maybe in a different emphasis, is I'm in both my approach to philosophy and to art, and indeed I might even say to life, I'm very committed to, I have to try to say this the right way, to process.
Yeah.
For me, philosophy is a practice, and its final work is in changing us. It is not building a product whose intrinsic value is its value. And I think the same is true of art. And to give another example, which is close to home to me, that has nothing to do with art or philosophy, I have 3 children, and raising children is not an easy thing to do. And I'm constantly burdened with the feeling that I'm not doing it well, because there are all these experts who tell you how you're supposed to do it. You know, you do this, or you don't do that, or you don't do that, and you do this. And I don't view my children as my product, although of course in some sense they are.
Yeah.
I view our lives together as one big experiment, and I'm trying to do the best I can by them. But and you know, my partner, she has different judgments about what's best for them than I do. And so how do we negotiate that? So the idea that you need to be flexible and open and negotiate is, to me, something very close to home. By the way, this idea also comes up in education as a teacher. These days at universities, they want measures for outcomes for everything. They want you to say, here's the proof that you're a good department because you've got X number of publications, and here's the proof that your students are learning because they did so and so well on the exam. And then here's the student evaluations, and if the student evaluations say you're fantastic and they love you, then it's a good class, and if they say you're boring and they don't like you, it's a bad class, as if that has anything to do with anything.
Exactly.
So I'm interested. To me, the ideal teacher, and I'm not describing myself at all, but to me, the ideal teacher is a teacher that creates a space in which students make knowledge. And it could be boring and uncomfortable. I don't care whether it's easy, but I'm not a factory worker making students.
No.
I'm talking with living human beings with their own values and problems and concerns. And the best I can do as a professor is guide them through my own practice in understanding what I think is valuable and engaging. And they can reject me, they can admire me, however they respond. Finally, they're on their own. And it's a process.
Yeah, well, I fully agree with that, Alva. I mean, two fundamental aspects of our outlook. The first is provisionality, which I was talking about originally, but the other one is incrementality, and I think that's largely what you're talking about there.
Yeah.
I mean, no final goals, the fact that we are embodied beings limited by all our senses, our language, our culture, etc. So whatever decisions we make, inevitably, they are going to be limited. I mean, I'm an ex-teacher too, and I spent many situations as a foreign language teacher in classes where there was this expectation, you know, I'm a vessel, fill me.
Yes.
And but as you know, when a class is bubbling away, and it's when you know learning is taking place, is when you're part of that process and they accept you as fallible too, and I think a lot better learning situation can take place then.
Yeah. And, you know, when you look at one of the consequences, see, another aspect of what you're talking about that I think is so important, and I'm probably saying ideas that are very commonplace to your listeners and your members, but if there isn't a single right way, then that means that lots of experimentation and indeed screwing up is our fate. And we need to accept that. We need to accept that, how can I tell whether I should get married? Or how can I tell whether I should take this job? Or how do we solve the problem of ISIS? And, you know, the idea that there are single answers, but that doesn't mean that there are not answers.
No.
But it means, but really there are conversations or engagements with problems and reflections on them. And you're right. Sometimes you do need to be decisive. Sometimes life doesn't wait for you to twiddle your thumbs. You've got to go left or go right.
One of your colleagues, an American woman called Catherine Schultz, she wrote this book called Being Wrong. It basically summed me up, Alva.
I have that. I read that book. Yeah, it's very good. She's very smart.
Yeah, and funny.
Yeah.
Anyway, just to summarize, Alva, what is art? Why does it matter? And what does it tell us about ourselves?
Art it's not stuff. It's not things. It's not even abstract things like like plays and poems. Art is a practice, and I think that it is a practice of unveiling us to ourselves and doing so in ways that give us the resources to be different. Art and also philosophy, I think, are reorganizational practices. Artists make stuff because making, in the broadest sense of the word, making, doing, is essential to what it is to be human. So by making, makers, artists, bring out the ways in which we are made, or the ways in which we make ourselves. And it's because we matter that art matters. Art matters because of what it reveals about us. And so then there isn't a simple answer to the question, what does it tell us about ourselves? I would say art is a domain in which we ask questions about ourselves.
That's great. Okay. What's your greatest hope for the book, Alva?
Actually, I don't have an answer to that question. When you write a book, you are real, and this book, as you've read it, this is quite a personal book. I have artists in my family, and I'm very much, my concern with this question is very personal. And I don't know what my hope is, but I will say this: the book came out just 2 months ago. Or no, what am I saying? It came out the end of September, less than 2 months ago. And I have learned so much about the ideas of the book through talking with people. For example, in this interview, I want to immediately sit down and write some notes down, because every time I talk with people about the ideas, I come to understand the ideas in different ways. Yeah. So I almost feel as if this book is just the preliminary to my own learning process.
Fantastic.
And I'm looking forward to learning more. That's my hope.
Great. Okay. And my last question, if people wanted to find out more about your work, how would they go about it?
I have a website, and it's my name is Alva Noë, Alvanoe. And if they go to alvanoe.com, they can find links to my other books, and some of my papers can be downloaded. And I also write a weekly essay or post, we call it, for National Public Radio. National Public Radio has a science blog called 13.7 Cosmos and Culture. And every week I write something. I usually post it on Friday morning, US time on the East Coast. And sometimes the things I write there, sometimes they're very small, and sometimes they're quite substantial. But I discuss. It's a place where I play with ideas and often have very interesting dialogues with the public. So, but my website is a good place. And yeah.
Okay. Well, anyway, Alva, I wish you every success with the book. It certainly deserves it. It's been wonderful talking to you today, and great fun too.
Yeah, great, real pleasure for me. Very enriching, and I'm grateful. And good luck to you and the Middle Way Society.
You can find out more about Middle Way philosophy at www.middlewaysociety.org.